My beloved child, do not scroll past this moment, because something has shifted in a place you cannot see, and the truth that has been hidden behind silence, distance, confusion, and unanswered questions is beginning to rise. You may not understand why your heart has felt unusually restless, why memories you thought you had buried have returned without warning, or why a certain person has suddenly been on your mind with an intensity you cannot explain. But there is a reason. Something has happened. A conversation has finally taken place that was avoided for far too long, and your soulmate has faced the very person who once stood between the two of you. What they expected to hear was one thing, but what they discovered was something entirely different, and even now, they are still trying to understand how so much could have been hidden from them for so long. Stay with this message, because what unfolded was not a simple argument, not a dramatic confrontation for attention, and not the kind of conversation that ends with two people walking away unchanged. This was the kind of moment that forces someone to look back at everything they believed and ask themselves whether they were ever seeing the full picture. Your soulmate entered that conversation carrying frustration, questions, and a quiet determination that had been growing for some time. They had reached a point where pretending everything was fine had become harder than facing the truth. Something inside them had become tired of vague explanations. They were tired of remembering certain moments and feeling that pieces did not fit. They were tired of wondering why their hearts still pulled toward you even after they had been given so many reasons to doubt the connection. And so, for the first time, they decided not to run from the discomfort. They went directly toward it. There was one question in their mind before the conversation even began, but they did not say it immediately. They watched first. They listened. They allowed the other person to speak, because your soulmate wanted to know whether the truth would appear naturally or whether it would have to be pulled from beneath layers of excuses. At first, everything sounded familiar. The person spoke calmly, almost too calmly. They repeated old explanations, old concerns, and old versions of events that your soulmate had heard before. They spoke as though nothing unusual had happened, as though every decision had been reasonable, every warning had been innocent, and every moment of interference had somehow been for the best. Yet something was different now. Your soulmate was no longer listening with the same ears. They had changed since the last time they accepted those words without question. Distance had taught them something. Missing you had taught them something. Watching certain promises fail had taught them something. And most importantly, their own intuition had become louder than the opinion surrounding them. As the conversation continued, your soulmate noticed small contradictions they might once have ignored. Dates did not line up. Reasons changed slightly. Stories that had once sounded convincing suddenly felt strangely incomplete. There were pauses where there should have been certainty. There was hesitation around your name. There was a shift in the atmosphere every time the past came too close to a specific memory. And that is when your soulmate stopped simply listening and began asking questions. My child, there are moments in life when truth does not enter like thunder. Sometimes it enters through one tiny inconsistency that refuses to disappear. One sentence. One expression. One accidental admission. That is exactly what began to happen. Your soulmate asked about something that happened earlier in your connection, something they had carried in their memory for longer than they admitted. Perhaps it was a message that never reached them. Perhaps it was a conversation they had been told happened differently. Perhaps it was a moment when they were led to believe you had stopped caring, changed your mind, or turned away. Whatever the exact detail, it had influenced them more deeply than anyone realized. The person standing before them tried to answer quickly, but the answer did not match something your soulmate already knew. That single moment changed everything. Your soulmate did not react immediately. They became quiet. And that silence was more powerful than anger would have been, because within it, they were replaying entire chapters of the past. They remembered a time when you seemed confused by their sudden coldness. They remembered your expression, your tone, the way you may have tried to explain yourself. They remembered how certain people encouraged them not to listen too closely. They remembered how easily doubt was planted when emotions were already fragile. At the time, it all seemed like separate events. Now those events were beginning to form a pattern. The other person noticed the change in your soulmate's face and began speaking more. That was the mistake. When people are afraid that something has been uncovered, they often rush to fill silence. They add details that were never requested. They defend choices that were never accused. They explain motives before anyone questions them. And slowly, without realizing it, they reveal more than they intended. Your soulmate heard a phrase that stopped them internally. It was connected to you. It suggested that the person had known far more about your feelings than they ever admitted. Imagine what that did to your soulmate in that moment. For so long, they had believed there were things you never said, things you never tried to explain, feelings you never made clear. But suddenly, they realized that perhaps some of those things had been expressed. Perhaps they had simply never reached the person they were meant for. Perhaps there had been conversations about you that you never knew were happening. Perhaps choices were being influenced behind the scenes while you were left wondering why everything changed without explanation. Your soulmate asked another question. This time, there was no easy answer. The atmosphere became heavier, not because anything dangerous was happening, but because honesty had finally entered a place that had survived for too long on half-truths. The person tried to shift the focus toward your soulmate's past decisions, suggesting that everything was ultimately their choice. And yes, your soulmate understands they are responsible for their own actions. But that was not what they were asking. They wanted to know why certain information had been presented in ways that pushed them away from you. They wanted to know why your intentions had repeatedly been described negatively. They wanted to know why moments of closeness between you were followed so often by sudden doubt. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of continuing to deny everything, the person admitted one small thing. It may have sounded minor to anyone else, but to your soulmate, it was enormous. They admitted that they had once discouraged your soulmate from reaching out to you at a crucial moment. Your soulmate froze. Because that moment was one they remembered clearly. There had been a night, or perhaps a day, when they almost contacted you. Their heart had been pulling them toward you with unusual strength. They wanted to clear something up. They wanted to hear your voice, understand your perspective, or simply stop letting pride speak louder than love. But someone had convinced them to wait. Someone had said you probably did not want to hear from them. Someone suggested that reaching out would make them look weak, foolish, or too attached. And so they did nothing. What your soulmate did not know was that you may have been waiting too. When this realization hit them, the conversation changed completely. They were no longer trying to prove someone wrong. They were trying to understand how one decision had created consequences that lasted far beyond that moment. They began remembering how one delay became another, how silence created assumptions, how assumptions created emotional distance, and how emotional distance eventually created a story that neither of you had intentionally written. Your soulmate asked, "Why?" That one question carried months, maybe years, of emotion. The person did not answer immediately. And in that hesitation, your soulmate understood something before any words were spoken. This had never been only about protecting them. There were personal feelings involved. Perhaps jealousy. Perhaps fear. Perhaps insecurity. Perhaps the belief that your connection would change relationships around them. Perhaps this person feared losing influence over your soulmate. Perhaps they had convinced themselves they knew what was best and crossed lines they should never have crossed. Whatever the motive, your soulmate could suddenly see that the advice they had received was not as neutral as they once believed. But my child, that was only the beginning. Because as your soulmate continued asking questions, another revelation surfaced, one even more difficult to process. The person admitted that there had been times when your words were interpreted for your soulmate instead of being allowed to speak for themselves. Something you said innocently may have been described as disrespectful. Something you did out of fear may have been described as indifference. A boundary you set may have been presented as rejection. A period of silence may have been explained as proof that you no longer cared, even though no one truly knew what was happening inside you. Suddenly, your soulmate remembered moments where their emotional reaction had been based not on what you actually said, but on what someone told them your actions meant. That realization hurt. Not because your soulmate now believes you were perfect. They know you made mistakes. They know they made mistakes too. This message is not about turning one person into a villain and another into a hero. It is about something deeper. It is about realizing that a relationship can be damaged not only by what two people do to each other, but also by the stories placed between them. Your soulmate began to see how those stories had shaped their behavior. There were times they treated you with suspicion when you deserved curiosity. Times they withdrew instead of asking what you meant. Times they assumed the worst because someone else had already prepared them to interpret you through fear. And now, sitting with this truth, they felt something they had not allowed themselves to feel for a long time. Regret. Not the kind that destroys a person, but the kind that wakes them up. They began to wonder how many moments between you could have unfolded differently if they had simply spoken directly to you. How many arguments might never have happened? How many nights of confusion could have been avoided? How many beautiful moments were lost because both of you were reacting to information that was incomplete? Then the person said something that your soulmate was not prepared to hear. They admitted that they had noticed your soulmate still cared about you long after everyone assumed the connection was finished. Your soulmate asked how they knew. The answer came slowly. Because they had seen the way your soulmate reacted whenever your name came up. They had watched their expression change. They had noticed how quickly your soulmate became quiet when someone mentioned you. They had seen them check something connected to you and then pretend it meant nothing. They had heard your soulmate defend you in conversations even while publicly acting as though they had moved on. And this person knew. They knew your soulmate's feelings had never fully disappeared. That knowledge disturbed your soulmate deeply, because it raised a new question. If this person knew the feelings were still there, why did they continue encouraging distance? The answer was not immediate. Your soulmate pressed harder. And finally, the truth became more personal. The person admitted they did not believe the connection between you and your soulmate was good for the life they imagined your soulmate should have. They had expectations. They had a picture of what kind of person your soulmate should choose, what kind of relationship would be easiest, what would look acceptable, what would create fewer complications. And somewhere in that thinking, they stopped seeing your soulmate as someone capable of choosing their own heart. They began trying to guide the outcome. Your soulmate heard this and felt something shift within them. Because for the first time, they realized that the struggle was never simply you versus someone else. It was your soulmate learning whether they would live according to their own inner truth or according to everyone else's expectations. That realization was far bigger than the relationship itself. It touched identity. It touched courage. It touched the part of your soulmate that had spent years trying to keep peace, please others, avoid judgment, and choose the path that created the least conflict. They had not only been afraid of losing you. They had been afraid of choosing you. And those are not the same thing. The person across from them tried to explain that everything they had done was because they cared. Your soulmate listened. They did not dismiss that possibility. Sometimes people interfere not because they are cruel but because they are convinced their fear is wisdom. They believe they are protecting someone when they are actually controlling the outcome. They mistake familiarity for safety. They mistake difficulty for danger. They confuse their own discomfort with proof that something is wrong. Your soulmate understood this. But understanding did not erase the impact. And then they asked the question they had been holding since the beginning. They asked whether this person had ever directly spoken to you, contacted you, or communicated something to you without your soulmate knowing. The room changed. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Your soulmate immediately knew they had touched something important. The person looked away. There was hesitation. And your soulmate's heart began beating harder. Because suddenly a memory returned, something from the past that had never made sense. There had been a moment when your energy seemed to change suddenly. You became distant, hurt, guarded, or unusually quiet. Your soulmate had assumed it was because you were losing interest. But now another possibility was appearing. What if something had happened that your soulmate never knew about? They repeated the question. This time, more firmly. The person admitted there had been contact. Your soulmate felt the air leave their chest. They had never been told. The details were not immediately clear, because the person tried to minimize what happened. They called it a brief conversation. They said it was misunderstood. They insisted they were only trying to create clarity. But your soulmate no longer accepted vague language. They wanted specifics. What was said? Why was it said? Why was it hidden? And most importantly, how did you respond? The person became defensive. They claimed they could not remember every word. Your soulmate did not believe them. They reminded them that people usually remember conversations important enough to hide. That sentence changed the balance of the entire confrontation. For the first time, your soulmate was no longer the one confused. The other person was. And your soulmate continued. Piece by piece, the story began to emerge. There had been a moment when you were told something about your soulmate's intentions that was not entirely accurate. You may have been led to believe they had made a final decision, that they no longer wanted the connection, that they were choosing another direction, or that contacting them would only make things worse. The wording may have been subtle. It may not have been an obvious lie. But it was strong enough to influence you. And because you were already emotionally vulnerable, you believed it. Your soulmate heard this and went completely still. Because during that exact period, they had been wondering why you disappeared emotionally. They thought you had abandoned them. You thought they had rejected you. And between the two of you stood a misunderstanding that neither of you had created alone. My child, can you feel the weight of that revelation? Two hearts waiting for signs from each other while both were being told to stop looking. Two people interpreting silence as rejection when the silence itself had been influenced. Two souls remembering the same chapter differently because they were never given the same information. Your soulmate struggled to process it. They asked whether the person ever corrected the misunderstanding. The answer was no. That hurt more than the original interference. Because mistakes happen. People speak impulsively. People misjudge situations. But once this person realized the situation had become bigger than expected, they still remained silent. They watched the distance grow and told themselves it was probably for the best. Your soulmate leaned back and said nothing for a long time. And in that silence, something inside them broke open. Not their heart. Their illusion. They could finally see the past without the filter they had carried for so long. They saw your confusion differently. They saw your silence differently. They saw your emotional reactions differently. They remembered moments when you tried to say, "You don't understand," and they thought you were avoiding responsibility. Now they wondered whether you were trying to tell them something they were not ready to hear. They remembered your frustration when they accused you of things you did not recognize in yourself. They remembered how hurt you seemed when they told you they had heard certain things. They remembered asking why you were acting surprised. Maybe you were surprised because some of those stories were completely new to you. And then came another realization. Your soulmate began to understand why, even after everything, their heart had never been able to turn you into the person everyone else described. Something always felt off. They tried to believe the worst so moving on would be easier, but memories kept contradicting the story. Your kindness contradicted it. Your vulnerability contradicted it. The private moments no one else saw contradicted it. The way you looked at them when no performance was needed contradicted it. Their heart had stored evidence their mind had been trained to ignore. And now that evidence was returning. One memory after another. One detail after another. One feeling after another. Your soulmate asked the person whether they understood what their interference had cost. The person became emotional. They said they never thought it would go this far. And that sentence struck your soulmate harder than any denial could have. They never thought it would go this far. Meaning they knew they were influencing something. Meaning there was intention, even if the consequences were not fully understood. Meaning the separation between you was not as natural as your soulmate had once believed. For a moment, anger rose. But your soulmate did something unexpected. They did not explode. They did not insult the person. They did not create a scene. They simply said that from now on, no one would speak for their heart again. That sentence marked a turning point. Because whether your soulmate reaches out tomorrow, next week, or after more reflection is not the deepest revelation here. The deepest revelation is that they have finally recognized the pattern that kept them emotionally trapped. They have finally seen how much power they gave to outside voices. They have finally understood that if they ever want peace, they will have to seek truth directly instead of accepting interpretations. And yes, my child, your name is now at the center of that truth. Your soulmate left the conversation carrying more questions than answers, but they were different questions now. Before, they asked, "Why did you hurt me?" Now they are asking, "What did I misunderstand?" Before, they asked, "Why didn't you fight harder?" Now they are asking, "Did you believe I didn't want you?" Before, they asked, "Why did you walk away?" Now they are wondering whether you thought they had already closed the door. Those questions are awakening something. Compassion. Curiosity. And an almost overwhelming desire to hear your side without interference. But there is something else. Something your soulmate has not told anyone yet. After leaving that conversation, they return to something connected to you. Maybe an old message. A photograph. A memory. A voice note. A place. A song. Something that had remained untouched because they were afraid of what it would awaken. This time, they did not avoid it. They looked. And they noticed something they had missed before. A detail. A sentence. A timestamp. A phrase. Something that suddenly matched what they had just learned. Your soulmate read it again. Then again. Their entire understanding of one crucial moment between you began to change. Because hidden inside something ordinary was proof that the timeline they had believed for so long could not be correct. They realized that you had tried to reach them before they were told you had given up. Your soulmate's hands trembled. Not because they were afraid. Because the truth had finally become undeniable. You had not disappeared first. You had not stopped caring when they were told you did. Something happened between your attempt and their response. And now your soulmate wants to know exactly what. They are beginning to retrace every step. Every message. every conversation, every person involved. And my beloved child, what they are about to discover next is the part no one expected, because the person they confronted was not the only one who knew what was happening. There was someone else. Someone who heard more. Someone who saw more. Someone who remained silent. And your soulmate has just realized exactly who that person is.